Do you lose your right to save your life, to save someone else's life because you're not carrying lawfully? Or even think about, let's say you're a prohibited person. Well, every place is, every place is off limits to you theoretically, right? Under federal law. So do you have to just die? We are the Armed Attorneys. Today we're talking about and answering the question, should you stop a mass attack? Now, we all know it's more important than ever to everyday carry, but we're going to be talking about the kind of legal considerations in defending yourself and others in these situations. When could you lose self-defense or even have a legal duty to retreat imposed upon you, and some practical considerations. But before we begin, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting that like button. And this is, unfortunately, a topic we have to talk about.
It is. And just, I will put a disclaimer up here. In order such that YouTube continues to distribute this video, we will be doing our word salad dancing around certain words. There are just things that we are not going to be able to say and still have YouTube show you this video. I don't want to wind up in Google jail. I don't want it to get demonetized. We do have other platforms out there available. You can check us out on Rumble. Follow our Patreon, although Patreon's still linked to YouTube. So just check us out on Rumble if this goes away, but we're going to do our best to keep it up.
Yeah. So, I think this is a tough one, and keep in mind, we're not the tactics people.
Yep.
There's lots of great folks on YouTube. They'll go over the tactics. They'll go over the make yourself more on target, more lethal, more effective. Go talk to those guys. We're going to be talking about the kind of legal considerations behind all this. And I think the conversation naturally starts with the, hey, when can I defend myself and others? And I think it's a good answer.
Yes. So this is generally speaking, the very minutia specifics of your state law will vary, but they all pretty much come down to this. You defend yourself from a life threat when it is immediately necessary to do so, and a reasonable person would concur with you that your actions were immediately necessary. So obviously we are doing this video in the wake of New Orleans. We all have things like this on our minds. I mean, we've seen things like that in Europe for years now.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And I think I think we're going to see more of it here. I mean, that's the
sad part. Yeah. But maybe we can minimize, there's good data behind, hey, guess what? The number one predictor of how bad these things are is how quickly do they encounter armed resistance. And so, I think there's some encouragement there. But yeah, going back to Emily, those three elements, reasonable, immediately necessary. And then you look at the level of the threat. Is it unlawful deadly force? Maybe your state calls it something else. If yes, hey, guess what? That's when we're talking about general self-defense. But when we talk about defending another person, what do most states look at?
Most states look at that standard for defending self, and they just apply it to anyone else. They say, look, if that thing that was going to happen to you that could cause you to defend yourself with deadly force against that life threat, if that's happening to someone else around you, any third party, you can also defend that third party. Now, there are some states that pull that in quite a bit, that their statutes on the books maybe still list like it has to be your wife, your children, your immediate family. Although even in those states, most of those have actually expanded that protection through their jury instructions and through case law. But your state's law will vary. Generally, almost everywhere, look at the thing happening to the crowd of people and decide, hey, if he was pointing that weapon at me, rather than that guy, could I defend myself?
Yeah, you're in their shoes. What would they be allowed to do? Could you defend yourself? And so, and then practically from this aside from, hey, these states don't recognize the right to keep and bear arms. They hate the Second Amendment. They hate people protecting themselves. They want the government to be your nanny and take care of you. Do those people who stop these big threats, do those people get prosecuted? I don't see a lot of precedent for that, even in violation of state law. I mean, hopefully you're getting like a medal from the governor.
Right. I mean, we've covered a couple cases like out of Maryland and I think maybe even Virginia, in which the good guy stopping a big old threat ended up prosecuted for some level of carry crime, right? Like there was someone whose license wasn't recognized. It was like all those, what my very southern mother calls all those itty bitty states all scrunched together up there.
Sure.
Like basically he had crossed state lines and his license wasn't recognized in the state he was in. He ended up getting prosecuted for that, even though he stopped this MS Can't say that on YouTube.
Sure.
But, you know, I mean, it's rare, and it's not going to be in most places.
Yeah. And so, all right, we got defense lined up. We have defense of others lined up. There's a common thread that runs through this, and it's really important. If you find yourself in one of these situations, you make the conscious decision, hey, guess what? I'm not going to let this get any worse. I'm going to save my own life. I'm going to save somebody else's life. There are situations where you can lose self-defense, defense of others, and, you know, open yourself up to tremendous legal liability if you do this, and we don't want you getting prosecuted and charged or even convicted of something very serious like a murder charge. And when do people find themselves in that situation?
Well, I mean, I think a big one is going to be when your mental state is reckless, because in most places in the country, right, and we've talked about this before, but just very briefly, you have your mens rea, you have your actus reus, right? You have your guilty mind and you have your guilty act. Well, your guilty mind can vary anything from negligence, it's an accident, that's normally not criminal, to I intentionally shot the guy, which is, you know, generally going to be the situation here. However, when your guilty mind is a state of recklessness, defined as a knowing disregard of a substantial risk to human life and safety, you could face criminal prosecution. So how does that apply here? If you are, and like I'm making up a hypothetical, right? Okay. So a million different ways it can apply. But let's say you are witnessing an attack like we're talking about, and you have a firearm on you, but you are totally untrained. You know, you didn't even bother to get your license to carry. You have maybe shot the thing one time and you're like, aha, this is my time. And you take out your gun and you have just no aim and you start indiscriminately firing bullets, maybe in the direction of the guy, but really you're just hitting a bunch of innocent bystanders. That is probably reckless.
Yeah.
What was the recklessness? You know, knowing that you had no ability to actually use the firearm, and yet firing in the direction of many, many parties, including the guilty party. There's a lot of states and a lot of prosecutors out there who will probably get you for aggravated assault, deadly weapon by means of recklessness, and a manslaughter.
Yeah, and to contrast that example with maybe a slightly different take on it, all right, you see the person, attacker, you've made the decision, all right, reasonable, immediately necessary. They're posing a threat of unlawful deadly force. I'm going to make the decision to stop them. Clear, nobody around them, attackers there, and right as you've already made the decision, your fingers pressing the trigger, an innocent bystander runs through the scene and gets struck. Is that reckless?
Yeah, no, I would say likely not, right? So it is going to depend on the exact facts in the moment. Just, you know, I would say keep it in mind, but what are you going to keep in mind in a situation like that? I mean, that's really, really tough.
Yeah. Act reasonably in unreasonable circumstances.
Right. Or face prosecution.
Sure.
So anyway, so that is something to think about. What if, Richard, you are carrying in a place that you're not supposed to carry when such an event breaks out?
So, and I think this question comes up a lot. You know, do you lose your right to self-defense? You know, because this happens, whether it's under your state's like trespass law, or you know, you have statutorily prohibited places where you're not allowed to carry. You know, do you lose your right to save your life, to save someone else's life because you're not carrying lawfully? Or even think about, let's say you're a prohibited person. Well, every place is, you know, every place is off limits to you theoretically, right? Under federal law. So do you have to just die? No, of course not. You get to defend yourself. But what this can do is affect your self-defense rights. And what we see in most states are, there are several layers of self-defense. You know, think legal presumptions of reasonableness, where the law presumes your actions as reasonable and immediately necessary. You know, it would be up to the government to disprove that you didn't think these circumstances were happening. To, okay, maybe the burden's on the defender to persuade a jury that what they did was reasonable and immediately necessary. Or maybe even a step further, there's a duty imposed on them to try to attempt to retreat before using any level of force. And so we see, hey, guess what? Maybe you don't lose your right to self-defense, but maybe there are some legal duties imposed on you.
Right. And I would say losing stand your ground, if you are in a stand your ground state, is probably the minimum of the bad thing that's going to happen to you, because stand your ground, based on, what we call NRA model law. If you have a stand your ground law, it is probably based on the NRA model, and it is probably exactly what I'm about to tell you. You have a stand your ground if you are somewhere you are legally allowed to be, if you are not committing any other criminal act, sometimes over and above a Class C misdemeanor regulating traffic, and if you did not provoke the interaction which led to deadly force. You can sort of put a fourth step in there, which is that your actions were justified under the law, meaning that you acted reasonably and in immediate necessity to respond to that life threat. But if you are carrying someplace that you are not allowed by law to carry, you have probably trespassed and violated the law, or either or, but it is an almost a guarantee you will have lost stand your ground, meaning if you can safely retreat, you must. Right? Which is maybe what you want to do anyway, given the practical considerations here. I think we should talk through it.
Yeah. And all right, so think of NRA. That's NRA model. And it allows a jury to consider your failure to retreat. Okay, so that's what the NRA doctrine does. But we see these states that have really strict duty to retreats imposed, that they have to retreat. So just, you got to know your state's law.
Know your state's law.
But all right, practical considerations to all this stuff is, this is like the forum section of every, people picking apart this stuff and Monday morning quarterbacking these situations. There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. I will say, in any chaotic situation, if you are the good guy with a gun and you are using it in order to stop the threat, at least one of those 911 callers is going to call you in as the bad guy. I guarantee it. Because it is chaos, and they see people maybe they hear gunshots, they see carnage, there's smoke, it's loud, and they see, Richard with his everyday carry, and they're going to be like, 911, there is, a mass event happening here, bearded guy, blue shirt.
Yeah.
I see a gun in his hands.
Well, think about all the recent news stories. I'll say within the first hour, we hear multiple assailants is really, if you've read any of these news stories, they all are multiple assailant until the FBI comes out and says there isn't.
Boy, don't you trust the FBI right now?
Sure. But I will say,
on that game,
we'll put these recent incidents aside and look back historically. It's always multiple assailants, and then it usually comes down to one person.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely right. So that is something to consider. If the police are looking for Richard when they show up armed, they're going to find Richard. So you've got to, if you cannot get shot by police right off the bat, they're going to clear you, but that's your danger.
Yeah, but and I'd say, again, disclaimer, not the tactics, people. What we're about is, you want to minimize harm, you want to preserve human life. That includes yourself, loved ones, folks around you. I would encourage folks to go seek out training, professional opinions on the tactics to this, because these are very dynamic situations that I'll say rarely come up in self-defense cases. I can't say that I've handled a mass case where self-defense was involved, because you see these things get cleared, but you're still going to have going to need a lawyer, because this stuff is you're going to get dragged into the system.
Yeah. And, remember, should you choose to flee with the crowd, given all of the issues, pitfalls, your personal safety threat, should you go try to engage, fleeing with the crowd is not against the law, even if you are trained, even if you have your everyday carry. The Supreme Court says even cops can flee with the crowd, right? Although we are seeing some prosecutions on the state level for them not doing their jobs at some recent other events that I don't think we can say on YouTube. But should you flee with the crowd? That's probably the safest thing you can do, is put yourself in a big group of people and get the other way. So
I feel like we're that Onion article where we just say that's classified and but
yeah, no, that's pretty close.
It's a tough conversation, but knowing the kind of legal ground you stand on, I think, is really important, because what is this all about? Calculated risk assessment. Can you make an informed decision? If you're not on solid legal footing, if you make a decision, hey, it may be based on bad assumptions. So we encourage you to check out your state's law. But we hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video.
And always question and comment for us below. Until next time, we're the Arms Attorneys.